while 2023 may have been one of the best years for horror games in years, 2024 managed to follow that up with another decent year for the horror genre. Sure, 2024 definitely didn't have the same amount of AAA juggernaut horror games like 2023 had, such as Resident Evil 4 Remake, Dead Space Remake, and Alan Wake 2. But it did have a handful of dark horses that still managed to give us another good year for the horror genre. Whether you prefer narrative-driven indie horror games, remakes to classic survival horror games, or open-world action horror games, 2024 delivered for fans of any horror genre this year when it came to video games. So on this episode of Nerd Space Games, we'll be taking a deep dive into the many horror games that released this year as I give you guys my personal top 10 horror games of the year. Before we get started though, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to the channel for more survival horror content. Also, hit that like button if you enjoyed today's topic. Anyway, my name is Ruben with Nerd Space Games, and this is my top 10 best horror games of 2024. Let's get it. Number 10, A Quiet Place: The Road Ahead. In the past, movie licensed video games tend to get a bad rep, and for good reason. A majority of them usually flop as they are usually created in a hurry as a cash grab that attempts to use the movie license to make a quick buck instead of delivering us a good video game adaptation. Thankfully, the horror genre tends to be the exception. The Thing, Alien Isolation, and now A Quiet Place: The Road Ahead are three great examples of movie licensed horror games that were actually pretty damn good. The Road Ahead follows Alex Taylor, a young woman with asthma who must travel across a post-apocalyptic wasteland quietly while avoiding the deadly yet blind alien creatures seen in the movies of the same name. The Road Ahead is a first-person stealth horror game that leaves the player defenseless with very limited resources. As you would expect from a Quiet Place game, the player will need to avoid making noises that'll draw the attention of the aliens while also making their way across the wastelands in order to reach safety. The story is predictable yet satisfying, and the gameplay is pretty bare bones, but overall, A Quiet Place: The Road Ahead is a fantastic experience for fans of stealth-based horror games that appreciate atmospheric horror and tension above anything else. Number 9, Still Wakes the Deep. From one first-person stealth horror game to another, we now move over to the newest game developed by the Chinese Room, Still Wakes the Deep. For those that don't immediately recognize the name, the Chinese Room brought us Amnesia: A Machine for Pigs, and Everybody's Gone to the Rapture. However, in my personal opinion, Still Wakes the Deep is by far their best video game yet. The game follows an oil rig worker Cass who finds himself and his fellow employees trapped on an oil rig that has become overrun by some mysterious parasitic creature that has the ability to attach itself to humans and turn them into terrifying monsters. Throughout the game, Cass must find and rescue survivors, traverse an oil rig that is slowly breaking apart, and avoid parasitic monsters while also finding a way to stop it from infecting everybody on board and preventing it from making it back to land. Where Still Wakes the Deep really shines is the storytelling. Without a doubt, this game has one of the best and most creative stories of the year. One of which that'll allow you to connect with the main protagonist, Cass, as well as each and every crew member that you come across on this oil rig. The game does a fantastic job at establishing a strong connection between you and the player and the characters in a way that when you find them in tough situations, the tension builds and the stakes are high. These moments are when Still Wakes the Deep are at its peak. However, the game doesn't hide behind the story alone. The constantly changing environment, terrifying stalker enemies with distorted voices, and the anxiety and fear you experience throughout the story each time a character finds themselves in danger are just a few reasons why Still Wakes the Deep is one of the best narrative-driven horror games of 2024. Number 8, Conscript. If you've seen my top 10 indie horror games of 2024, then you might be noticing quite a trend as a lot of those games managed to make it on this list due to how much indie horror games dominated 2024. And while not your typical horror game, Conscript is a unique top-down survival horror game that is based on the horrors of war. Set in the trenches of World War I, the game follows Andre, a French soldier who is on a desperate mission to find his missing in action brother. During this time, the trench is overrun by enemy soldiers and Andre must battle through what seems like an endless swarm of enemies in order to find and rescue his brother. The horrors of war are explored perfectly here as the player is tasked with exploring dark and narrow corridors, hallways full of dead bodies and blood, and trenches full of enemies coming from every direction. Because of the lack of resources, the player will need to choose each battle carefully. The game also features challenging puzzles, multiple endings based on decisions made throughout the game, and inventory management, all while dealing with a terrifying environment in which all you hear are gunshots, screams, and other terrifying sounds constantly as you fully explore the trenches. Number 7, Crow Country. Crow Country is an indie survival horror game with PS1 retro graphics. Think Final Fantasy VII's polygon graphics. Anyway, the game follows Mara, a young woman who comes to an abandoned theme park named Crow Country in search of the missing owner of the park, Edward Crow. The game has all the elements that you would expect from a classic survival horror game: challenging puzzles, zombies and other monsters, and even tank controls. However, the game also features a dynamic aiming mechanic that allows the player to target weak spots. While that mechanic is not my favorite feature, it does add a new layer of gameplay for a classic style game like this. Plus, it's used in certain puzzles throughout the game as well. But there's two things that I really appreciate the most about Crow Country. The first is the setting. Having a horror game set in an abandoned theme park is something that just makes sense. Theme parks with nobody in them automatically creates a feeling of anxiety and dread. Then when you add in all the different areas that can be explored in this theme park, it creates some pretty unique experiences. In Crow Country's case, we get to explore a haunted house, employees underground tunnels, and an area themed underwater. The other feature that I really appreciate about Crow Country is the story. While I don't really want to dive too much into the story because of spoilers, I will say that the game features a mystery and some pretty interesting twists. Number 6, Senua Saga Hellblade 2. One thing that 2024 has really excelled at are narrative-driven psychological horror games. While that might seem like a very specific subgenre, the fact is that at least 3 games on today's list fit into that category. 2 of them we'll get to later on, but the first one on today's list is Senua Saga Hellblade 2. Continuing on from the first game, Senua has traveled to Midgard in search of the Slave Masters. Her mission is to kill the leader and stop the Northerners from traveling to her land and kidnapping people to use as sacrifices. Upon doing this, she learns that the Northerners are actually doing this because they fear giants. So she promises to stop these giants in the hope that she can stop the Northerners from performing sacrifices. The story is so much deeper than that, and it really dives into not only Senua's psyche, but the characters around her as well. It's without a doubt one of the deepest stories you'll ever experience in a video game, and it's also one that'll leave the door wide open for interpretation. Outside of the story though, the other major positive is the visuals. Every moment in this game is beautiful, and it's extremely impressive to look at. In fact, it might be one of the best looking games of the year based on its visuals alone. With that being said, the game does kind of lack on the combat side of things. As I said earlier, Senua Saga Hellblade 2 is a narrative driven psychological horror game, and it's not really much more than that. So I wouldn't go into this game and expect impressive gameplay mechanics because that's not what this game is about. A game like this, you're playing for the immersion and the storytelling and not much more above that. However, those specific elements of the game are why it's in my top 10 horror games of 2024. Number 5, Hollowbody. Hollowbody is an indie tech noir survival horror game that follows Mara, a shipper who has crash landed in an abandoned city. The game combines sci-fi futuristic aesthetics with old school survival horror. This means that you can expect fixed camera angles, puzzle solving, and tank controls. As Mara, the player must explore a city that is in ruins and full of disturbing monsters around every corner. The first thing that I really want to applaud this game for is the fact that they completely nailed the atmospheric horror vibes that they were going for. Playing Hollowbody really took me back to my days of playing the original Silent Hill, thanks to the uneasy ghost town setting, dreary music, and monster designs that would keep you up at night. For this game being an indie horror game, the sound design was actually pretty top notch, and it really had me sitting on the edge of my seat. The puzzles were another feature of the game that I really appreciated, as I found myself stuck on multiple occasions and I ultimately had to take a step back to look at the bigger picture before being able to solve the puzzle. The story of the game is pretty confusing, but to be honest, that's to be expected for a psychological horror game like this. I mean, this game was heavily inspired by Silent Hill, and it clearly shows, even down to the fact that it has multiple endings in which the road to unlocking said endings are kind of off the beaten path. On top of everything I just mentioned, the game had surprisingly solid voice acting, in which Mara was one of the better performances I've seen in a horror game this year. And while not a massively big area, Hollowbody still had plenty of areas to explore, to the point where the game didn't feel as linear as other indie survival horror games released around the same time. Number 4, Sorry We're Closed. At first, Sorry We're Closed felt more like one of those typical romance visual novels that my wife would play. However, when you really dive into the core gameplay mechanics, it takes some time to get to know each of these characters that make it more difficult to make certain decisions later on in the game. Sorry We're Closed was easily one of the best indie survival horror games of the year. Hell, it's one of the best horror games of the year, period. The game follows Michelle, a young store clerk who is still recovering from the breakup with her girlfriend when a demon appears in her dreams one night and curses her with a third eye. While this third eye grants Michelle with unique abilities that allow her to fight demonic spirits and see things in both our reality and the demon realm, it is also a death sentence in which it will claim Michelle's life after a predetermined amount of time. In order to stop this process, Michelle must use her new ability to team up with friends or even unlikely allies to stop the curse while also saving those close to her. I'll leave it at that for the synopsis of the game, as there's a lot of spoilers and the game really could go different directions based on the player's decisions. Starting with the gameplay, Cyberclose makes use of both first person and third person. While traveling through different areas of the game, Michelle is in third person. However, whenever she needs to aim her weapon at an enemy, it switches to first person. It's a mechanic that might seem annoying at first, but ultimately is handled really well, and it's actually really smooth, especially when combined with the third eye abilities that allow you to destroy weak spots on enemies and solve puzzles throughout the game. While the game does start off slow, it does a fantastic job at developing characters. One of my personal favorites is Darrow, who's pretty much a douchebag, but I love him anyways. The last thing I want to applaud Cyberclose for before moving on is the soundtrack. While some of these sequences don't really match the music, the boss fights without a doubt have some of the most killer soundtracks ever, and I'm all about it. Seriously, I was hyped throughout most of the boss fights thanks to the soundtrack alone. Overall, a phenomenal game that I highly recommend if you're a fan of either survival horror, visual novels, or narrative-driven games with multiple endings. Number 3, Banishers, Ghosts of New Eden. While most don't really qualify Banishers Ghosts of New Eden as a horror game, I would argue that it has all of the same traits and elements that you would expect from an action horror game. Banishers Ghosts of New Eden is an open world action horror adventure game that puts the player to the shoes of two Banishers, aka Ghost Hunters, Antea and Red. After hunting down one of the most powerful ghosts that either Antea or Red has faced, Antea is killed by her and she becomes the very thing that Red has sworn to banish, a ghost. Despite that, Antea and Red agreed to work together in order to rid New Eden of the ghost that killed Antea, while also searching for a way to save Antea from her tragic fate. Starting with the gameplay, Banishers features unique mechanics that require the player to change between Antea and Red to use both supernatural and physical abilities to defeat the undead. With elements of RPG added, the player could upgrade different abilities and skills to make both Antea and Red more powerful and more resourceful. While the main story of the game focuses on finding a way to banish the ghost that killed Antea and a way to save Antea, the game is actually full of side quests in the form of hauntings. These hauntings are actually my favorite part of the game, as you get to see some pretty shocking reveals and some deep storylines that you only get to know about if you complete these quests. Then at the end of each haunting, you have to make a difficult choice that could influence one of the multiple endings that you could get at the end of the game. The boss fights are also pretty interesting, with my personal favorite being the puppeteer. Each ghost has a story to tell, and each haunting usually leads to a twist that'll leave you speechless when the truth is revealed. Number 2, Mouthwashing. This game will go down as one of my favorite psychological horror games of the last decade. Seriously, it's that good. Now, full disclosure, a lot of the reasons why I really love this game so much comes down to the story of the game itself. And to really dive down into that, I would need to talk about spoilers, which I really don't want to do. And for that reason, my explanation as to why I love this game so much is going to seem pretty bare bones compared to other entries on this list. But trust me, if you know, you know. Anyway, here's what I will say about the game. The aesthetics and animation style of Mouthwashing is definitely not one of the best features. It takes some getting used to, but once you get through that aspect of the game, you're treated to a phenomenal story that is as deep and as disturbing as a story seen in a Silent Hill game. Yeah, it's that impactful. The game follows a crew of 5 that find themselves stranded in the farthest reaches of space. It's a psychological horror game that will seriously dive into the deepest and darkest fears of everybody aboard the ship, and it will leave you speechless by the end of the game. Mouthwashing is a first-person horror game that, like a few other entries on this list, is a walking horror simulator in which the player will be asked to complete different objectives and tasks aboard the ship while the crew waits for someone to come and save them. In the meantime, the player will face some truly horrifying visuals and sequences that will give you nightmares after experiencing them. Between the atmospheric horror environment, the terrifying monster and creature designs that you see throughout the game, especially closer to the end of the game, and a top-notch psychological horror story that will leave you completely speechless by the end of it all, Mouthwashing is my personal favorite indie horror game of the year, and it's a game that I think I will find myself talking about years to come just based on the story alone. Number 1, Silent Hill 2. Silent Hill 2 Remake is my horror game of the year, and to be honest, I don't think that's really a surprise to most of you guys watching this. Full disclosure, I was really hating on Silent Hill 2 and Bloober Team leading up to its release. Straight up, the trailers just really didn't do this game justice. Thankfully, all of those concerns were pointless, as Bloober Team really did deliver one of the best remakes ever in the form of Silent Hill 2 Remake. The original game already had one of the best stories seen in a psychological horror. And with improvements made to characters, additional interactions, and top-notch voice acting led by Luke Roberts as James Sunderland, the story is just as good, if not then better than the original game. The gameplay was heavily inspired by modern remakes such as Resident Evil 2 Remake. And surprisingly, Bloober Team really killed it here as well. The melee mechanics combined with dodge mechanics allow combat against enemies like the mannequins and nurses to be extremely challenging yet satisfying. Even the boss fights, something that was pretty weak in the original game, is improved on drastically. Each boss fight felt dynamic and different from each other. And another surprise for me is how many puzzles there were in Silent Hill 2 Remake. While the original game had plenty of them and they were all very challenging, the remake somehow upped the ante there as well. Silent Hill 2 Remake included more puzzles and more difficult ones throughout the game. The remake added other features too, like the ability to explore random stores and buildings for additional resources, something that I actually wondered about in the original game. But the most exciting improvement and the best part about Silent Hill 2 Remake, in my opinion, are the settings and the atmospheric horror vibe of the game. While the original game completely nailed that atmosphere, Bloober Team somehow enhanced each area of the game and made it feel even more unnerving and terrifying to explore. The transitions between the Otherworld and the Fog World felt a bit more noticeable, and exploring each location felt even more terrifying than they were in the original game. Personally, mannequins in this game became the most terrifying enemy of the game just for the mere fact that they would hide in random spots and attack the player when you got too close to them. Overall, Bloober Team did the impossible and delivered one of the best remakes of all time in the form of my game of the year, Silent Hill 2 Remake. But that does it for this episode of Nerd Space Games. Hit up the comments and let me know what you think of my list. Is Silent Hill 2 Remake your horror game of the year, or is there a different game that you think deserves that title? Let me know down below. Anyway, if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to my channel for more survival horror content. Also, leave a like on today's video if you enjoyed today's topic. But thanks for watching, and as always, I'll catch you guys in the next episode of Nerd Space Games. Take care.